Good morning, everybody. Greetings. Great you could be with us today. We're going to just get started in 30 seconds or so please just stand by. Morena, kia ora, good morning, wherever you are. Thanks so much for joining us from across New Zealand, Australia. I think we've got even a small smattering of North American colleagues joining us today. Great you could be with us. We're going to be talking about events and global best practices and events, and we're really honoured to have a couple of true event leaders from Australia that I'll introduce in a moment. My name is Chris Adams. I look after research and insights at Miles Partnership. And I think quite a number of you are familiar with Miles, 68 years old actually, been operating here in the South Pacific for significantly more than a decade. We work with 150 different destinations across all areas of destination marketing. Including quite a number here in the South Pacific. And we've been working in the event space directly, indirectly for all of those years in terms of supporting events as a critical part of the visitor experience and frankly what makes communities great places to live. I want to introduce and get Stu and Gil to just provide a little bit of background on themselves. We're delighted to be joined by Stu Spears, who's Director of Silver Lining Strategy, and Gil Menavini, who's a Creative Director and spent 15 years at Sydney. But why don't I pass over to you, Stu and Gil, to introduce yourself and provide a little bit of background on your experience.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, pleasure to be here. I suppose the start of my journey in events started at, I was heading up research and evaluation at Events New South Wales when it was set up in 2008. And that led into strategy roles. I found myself working for a couple of consulting firms and then starting up my own firm just over 4 years ago now. And in terms of my relationship with Gil, we work quite closely together on a number of things, but our relationship goes back to that time at Events New South Wales when Gil was the creative director of City of Sydney's events. And I might just throw to you now, Gil, to talk a little bit through your background.
Yeah, thanks, Stu, and thanks, Chris, and hi, everyone. Welcome. I have been working in the events industry for nearly 30 years. Sort of started out working in theatre as a theatre director and moved over to events when I got a job in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s with Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras as their first paid festival director. And that was a baptism of fire into big free public events, and that's been my area of expertise ever since. As Stu said, I worked for 15 years with the City of Sydney as their creative director and producer of events, and at that time we were the largest producer of free public events in Australia. 5 years ago I jumped ship and started my own firm, a bit like Stuart, and have been directing and producing and consulting in the events industry for that time. Part of that work was as the first director producer of Winter Feast, which is sort of the cornerstone event of Dark Mofo for Mona. Also developed and directed a winter event for the City of Melbourne called Firelight, and a range of other large scale and smaller scale events. During COVID, I've been working with Stuart consulting for the City of Ballarat, and also on my own doing some consulting for the City of Randwick, Sutherland Council, Events Tasmania, and a range of other organisations. So lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, Gil and Stu. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to kick it off and just talk about a major global benchmarking study we did for MB. That's how we connected with Stu. We had a good look around the world and identified 5 international best practices. one of them, this is best practices in terms of driving successful domestic tourism. So it was a very timely study. One of them was events. So I'm going to be distilling some of those insights. We're going to do a quick little poll on your event strategies, and then get Stu and Gil to share their experiences, insights, starting with the 6 fundamentals of successful events that over many years Stu has sort of developed, and we sort of highlighted as one of those international best practices. They're going to talk about some of the various events that they have been supporting and how those characteristics work in practice, and then we'll come to some couple of examples in a little bit more detail, and then some questions and answers from you. So international benchmarking study. This executive summary is available. I'll show you how to download this. MB last year commissioned Miles Partnership, and we actually undertook this work in conjunction with a Danish consulting company called Group Now. And we looked around the world at best practices in domestic tourism. And we identified really a range of sort of international best practices to respond to some significant challenges that New Zealand tourism was facing at that point. And that was the issue of dispersal and seasonality. And certainly up to sort of 2019, New Zealand tourism had grown substantially, driven by obviously a burgeoning international visitor flow, and yet seasonality, if anything, had got worse, and dispersal was still a significant challenge. And so we were looking in particular at those two challenges and how to develop a domestic tourism industry that really tackles the issue of seasonality and dispersal. We looked at initially at 30-odd countries, and then we did a deep dive into 8. And they were Australia, Canada, Ireland, Finland, Sweden, Slovenia, and the UK, and a number of states in some of those individual countries. And we came up with 5 international best practices that are all interrelated. We're going to be focusing on events today. But to build a successful domestic tourism industry, all of these things essentially sort of work together. You can download this executive summary by visiting this web address. I'll show you again at the end. And if you want a copy of the full report, just reach out to me. The executive summary is publicly available. The full report, which includes detailed summaries from each of those countries, is also available on request. So the international best practices that we identified around events specifically in that report, there are about 8 or 9 overall. I'm just going to pick up on 5 in the interest of time, and just go through each of these individually to talk about the significant way in which events are an absolutely fundamental part of your tourism offering and are central to tackling that issue of dispersal and seasonality. So off-season and dispersal, we actually identified Australia. Of all those countries around the world, they had the best mix, experience, and examples of using events in the most impactful way. And so that was really the genesis of the webinar today, and the work and support that's available in this whole event space is building off that identification of Australia as global best practice. So Victoria is one of quite a number of destinations that has been focused not only on domestic tourism, but in fact intrastate tourism for a number of years. So they launched about 8 years ago a campaign to promote, particularly for Melburnians, to get out and explore in Victoria. They realised that the most successful way to build regional tourism, particularly in the off-season in Victoria, was to focus on their immediate market of Melburnians and get them out and about. And so let's just have a quick look at one of their most recent sort of campaign ads that they've been running.
Everyone needs a bit of space, sometimes more and sometimes less. From personal space to breathing space, a creative space or reflective space, outer space, making space for more, and even the ever-elusive parking space. If you're looking for your happy space, we just might know the perfect place.
This has a total budget, your happy space, of $4 million. And you can see in terms of the offering that events is part of that. And I think that actually features Ballarat, which Stu and Gil might be talking about. White Nights is just one of the events. And so event strategy was a critical part of this Victoria intrastate marketing, and obviously creating compelling reasons for people to get out of Melbourne. And it's really focused around sort of decompression, relaxation, reconnection with your friends and family, and building that enduring, hopefully lifelong connection with Melburnians so that they feel comfortable and inspired to get out and explore places in their own state. So this is a campaign that's been running for many years, even prior to COVID, and really emphasizes a key best practice that we found around the world about the importance of building domestic and intra-state travel as a foundation. Part of it's been an aggressive regional event strategy. So in Victoria and a number of other states, there's a regional event fund, which is contestable, and you can apply for funding on a multi-year basis. And that will be one of the sort of best practices that Gil and Stu will be dive into in a moment. The second best practice is the whole concept of community engagement. And this is fundamental to the six successful strategies that Stu's going to be talking about. Slovenia, this is in Ljubljana. They're very successful food markets have been part of their program of events, and they are built entirely on incredible connection with their local community and local growers. And so I'll pass over to Stu, but Slovenia has a very successful model in terms of working with volunteer organizations of all types across the country, and part of that outreach and support is around events, even quite small community events, in terms of building their capacity and capability to run successful events in their own community. Third is the concept of picking winners in a long-term commitment. So we found, and I think Stu and Gil are going to emphasize again, that events do not become successful overnight or even in 2 or 3 years. They often take a number of years to build capacity and capability, connection and engagement. And so you need to be able to identify who are those best prospects and build a long-term commitment with them. Ari in Sweden is one of the Swedish examples that we looked at, and Ari is a ski resort. They were obviously very top heavy in terms of winter, quite weak on the summer side, and so they're one of a number of destinations that has built successful events, again, with this whole concept of building a 5+ year connection, for example, with their food weeks. So right this month in November, they're running their food weeks, obviously impacted this year by COVID, but that along with their mountain yoga retreats, you can see on the right there, have become, critical parts of their shoulder and off-season offerings, and again, actually with strong community engagement and connections. Oregon is another example of a state which has a multi-year connection with communities in terms of building capacity, including in events, and they've been working in some of those communities for 5 to 7+ years. The 4th out of 5 I'd highlight would be the halo effect, and so events can be transformational well beyond just travel and tourism. London, as well as Sydney, and we're going to hear about Vivid Sydney. Events can be impactful in terms of engaging with other communities and audiences of interest well beyond visitors. For example, industry sectors that you want to try and connect with. So that can be For example, tying in meetings or conferences, research gatherings around an event, and you use the event as an opportunity to engage and connect with people in other industry sectors. Becomes a reason for them to base their conference in your community during that period. And depending on what that event is, and this works obviously beautifully well in food, or for example, around the America's Cup, if you're targeting the yachting and sailing industry or marine industry more generally, there can be a strong connection into the event itself. And so Bill and Stu will talk about Vivid Sydney and some of the ways in which that has connected in with other industry sectors and obviously the arts and creative community as well. And that's to an increasing extent true of Dark Mofo in Hobart, which we'll hear about as well. And then just finally, measurement reporting is a critical part. And so part of the report, part of the Regional Events Fund requires reporting on a regular basis. And so Visit Victoria has a multi-year commitment to events that they've identified, and part of that's a rigorous economic impact assessment that looks at the results of the work and identifies areas for improvement. And that's all laid out in their Regional Events Fund guidelines that are part of the money in which they give. So having clear objectives and measuring against those objectives. Obviously, a lot of work has been done here in New Zealand, and ENVI, with input from Fresh Info, has developed guidelines for the evaluation and reporting criteria. And so there's a very strong grounding on which to base and some additional opportunities to build on that as well. We'll highlight a couple of those at the end. So those are the sort of just 5 of the international best practices that I would highlight out of the event space. We can come back to any of those in the question phase. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Stu and Gil after we just get your input on a poll question. So if we could launch this poll question, we want to just ask how important are events to your domestic visitor marketing strategy for next year, for 2021? So you might be targeting, obviously, just seeking to grow domestic visitation. You might be looking to target those areas of off-season or regional dispersal. So if you could vote, and we'll pull up the results. Just give you another few seconds. Okay, let's have a look at the results. So obviously everybody's on the webinar today, which indicates you're obviously interested in this space. So 55% very important and nobody below important. So that's good. Stu and Gil, let me pass over to you. And can you perhaps start it off by talking through the 6 fundamentals of successful events, and then go into some of the examples of how they work in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to, Chris. Thank you. I suppose the starting point for where this framework has come from was actually the idea of speaking to that point that Chris made as the third point of those 5 best practices, is the idea of picking a winner. During my time as head of strategy at Events New South Wales, I was asked by senior management to essentially create a framework that allowed us to understand whether we were picking a winner in the early days of an event when it didn't necessarily have any traction and was a new concept for everyone. So to Chris's point, there's a lead time required with these things, but it's often hard to convince government that funding them is worthwhile when they can't immediately see an economic return. And so that's where the foundation of this thinking is creating a framework that allows us to try and identify whether the key ingredients are at the core of an event, whether it be conceptual, new, in its first couple of years, or indeed it's a framework that can be applied back against an event that's really quite mature 20, 30 years in. So just to frame that discussion a little bit, today when we talk about events, just to be clear, we're talking about public-facing, generally annually recurring place-based events. They're not events that are being shipped around from place to place. And they're successful and sustainable in an operational and for financial sense. We're just carving those two things out from environmental sustainability today. In general terms, when we talk about these public-facing events, there's two types. There's the one-off events that tend to be transactional. Here in Australia, the state governments generally expect a return of somewhere between $10 and $20 of direct spend for every dollar they invest in an event. So by way of example, if they bought the exhibition, The Impressionists from Musée d'Orsay for $2 million, they'd expect $20 million of direct spend coming into the state for that, which would generally equate to about 20,000 visitors into the state. When it comes to recurring events, you can't quite be as what's the way to put it? You can't put the accounting rule over it quite as hard as that. These recurring events will resonate with locals and tend to be of place. They'll deliver on brand and community impact metrics in a way that those one-off events just simply won't. And there's a long-term approach required to deliver that economic benefit. And the example we'll speak to next is Vivid Sydney. I should just classify up front, whilst we understand Vivid and Mofo are massive events and have huge budgets, the fundamentals that apply here, we think, apply to every event of every size. We do have some examples of regional events that are later in the presentation, but just keep in mind, whilst we're showing things that clearly cost a lot of money, the fundamentals that we're getting at here, we think, resonate across all levels of events. When it came to Vivid Sydney, in that first year, that direct spend was about $4 million. It was less than $4 million actually, and it built up to last year a direct spend of $173 million. To show you that journey though, and in fact it wasn't $4 million, it was 2.5 at the start. And to keep in mind that the government bodies that were in charge of Vivid Sydney at that point were probably spending more money than that direct spend indicated, probably for most of this first 4 years. But it's critical to identify in that time the extent to which the community itself sees themselves in the event and loves the event, and because they will ultimately be your biggest advocates for bringing people into your region, or in this case into Sydney. So those first 4 years were really about building brand equity, building awareness of the event in the first place. And once that critical mass had been established, it was at a point where the return investment for marketing of the event would obviously be a lot more visible, easily done. There was an awareness of it. So therefore, if you said to someone in Melbourne, come to Vivid Sydney for X, Y, or Z, they knew what you were talking about in 2013. But to say that in 2009 would have fallen on deaf ears. So what's then key after that point of quite explosive growth is to just make sure that we're, oops, sorry, I've just skipped ahead. An important point to actually just take stock. It's a massive event now, as those economic impact figures would indicate. So it's important just to take stock and understand what's at the core of its success again, and make sure that we keep reminding ourselves as to why it was a success in the first place. So yeah, that just speaks directly to that best practice that Chris mentioned, backing a winner. What were the fundamentals that sat, we're on a winner here, and that's what these 6 fundamentals have been built off the back of. They've been refined quite a lot since then, as I've worked with a whole host of events. Generally, my work is in regional Australia now, so with much smaller communities and much smaller events. But as I said before, the principles remain the same. So the first of the 6 fundamentals is an alignment with community values. And so we'll take this from the theoretical into the practical and show some examples of events that tick these boxes really well. But when it comes to community values, the extent to which an event embodies the community's core values and desires, and values that locals like to see in themselves and are proud to own. And ultimately that will turn them into advocates for your event if they see themselves in the event. Event delivery capacity, the extent to which the event will be owned and driven by skilled, passionate and committed locals. That was a point that Vivid was quite close on, because at the core of Vivid Sydney was this idea of harnessing the power of the creative community in Vivid. Sydney, I should say. It was Sydney over-indexed in terms of industry, so they were put at the core of the festival from the word go. And then finally, support from key stakeholders. The extent to which the event is supported and guided by key bodies such as councils, tourism and event bodies, businesses and investors. And for events in their infancy, understanding that things will take a long time to actually mature and start to deliver those economic returns that we're after is key to that support. By way of example, just the way that I take my clients through this, under each of these fundamentals is a 5-point scale, and that 5-point scale the same, the definition on next to each of those scores does. As you'll see there, it's relatively subjective, but the point of the exercise is just to put us through the thinking to ask ourselves the extent to which we're strong across these fundamentals, and where we identify weaknesses, ask ourselves what we can actually do to address them. For fundamentals 4, 5 and 6, we start to tap into the idea of an event being having the potential to drive visitation from outside of your area. So the point of difference is the really critical thing in doing that. I would do quite a lot of work in Queensland, and there's a lot of communities up in Queensland that will say to me that they have a really great rodeo or a really great fishing event or a really great horse racing day. But the reality is that those things fundamentally don't have a point of difference to pretty much every other community around them. And that's what we're getting at with this, is finding a point of difference, finding a theme and a festival that resonates with your local community, but also shows it is something that isn't replicated elsewhere. The target audience profile is the size of the potential audience that would come, the extent to which they'd be actually welcomed by the community in the first place. We don't want sort of a profile of people that wouldn't necessarily resonate with locals, and have time and resource to travel to the destination and actually deliver the yield that we want our hospitality and tourism businesses to enjoy. And then planning and positioning, the extent to which the event's timing assists in overcoming the target market barriers to actually travel to the event, and the extent to which it delivers visitors in an off-peak occupancy period when our hospitality providers can actually accommodate them. So let's take that from the practical now, with a few examples of events that have delivered really well under each of those fundamentals. Excuse me. The first, when it comes to alignment with community values, the reason that Vivid Sydney, one of the practices we put in place early, we were very lucky to have a very, very good piece of brand research on our hands that had included the views of thousands of Sydney-siders as to what it meant to be a Sydney-sider and what they prided themselves on. And what we did with that piece of brand work is that for every single piece of content that we proposed to put through into Vivid Sydney, we actually rinsed it through those brand fundamentals and asked, does it align or does it indeed strengthen those brand fundamentals? And if it did, there were 6. If it did just that for 3 or more, then it got the tick of approval straight away. if it only ticked the box for maybe 2, then we had to start questioning ourselves. And if it only ticked the box for 1 or indeed 0, then we pretty much shelved it as an idea. The other, not that I know the festival particularly well, but the little bit of reading that I've done about the Art Deco Festival in Napier suggests to me that there'd be a very, very deep connection with the community there because of the nexus or the reason for the event and the reason for the architecture in the first place, that being a natural disaster. So when you talk about tapping into collective psyche of a place, it doesn't really get much more powerful than the rebuild from a natural disaster. And the fact that that festival is grounded in that rebuild, essentially, to me, feels from afar. Again, this is something that I'm judging from afar and having done some reading. It feels to me like there's a really, really strong alignment with community values there. And that's something that's going to hold Art Deco Festival in really good stead moving forward, obviously. Event delivery capacity. Gil and I are currently working on the event strategy for Ballarat, for City of Ballarat. One of the events on their calendar is the Ballarat International Photo Biennale. That is about 5 iterations old. The first of those iterations was a very, very small event delivered by 6 amateur photographers. And over the journey, they have brought on patrons and they have brought on donors and some very skilled staff and built it up to the point that it's now broadly recognised as Australia's most leading photo exhibition. And the point being there is that the event delivery capacity built over the journey, and at exactly at the same time as that happened, the event's profile and content built in parallel with that. Support from key stakeholders. Gil, I might throw to you and your experience in the first 3 years when you ran Winter Feast at Dark Mofo, just to talk through the support that you were aware of between the government and indeed Mona itself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stu. Dark Mofo was built sort of on the support from key stakeholders because it was literally building an event from the ground up. And so it was like many events, the reason for it was to sort of solve a problem. And the problem was visitation in Hobart, or Tasmania generally, but specifically Hobart in winter. There's Tourism Tasmania and Events Tasmania had sort of tried everything from marketing campaigns to other events. And obviously with the strength of the Mona brand that had been building for about 3 or 4 years by then, Mona were offered some money from the state government to come up with an idea for a winter activation. So it was very much a partnership between stakeholders. There was $1 million a year for the first 3 years from Tourism Tasmania, so that's state government, and that relationship of stakeholders worked in sync with one another. So to the point where Tourism Tasmania was suggesting, event professionals like me to Mona to take on, fair significant parts of the event. The other key stakeholder right from the very beginning was the Tasmanian community, and specifically, again, the Hobart community, from artists to suppliers to, in my case with Winter Feast, if anyone's been, it's a food and wine and entertainment sort of event. But we partnered, we made a decision very early on that Winter Feast was going to just be about showcasing Tasmanian food and wine. And so the producers and providores, winemakers, etc., became really significant stakeholders in that. And then finally, the local community, because we knew that if the local Hobart community didn't support the event, it just wouldn't get up. And so we were very nervous actually in the first year about whether anyone would come. And I remember standing at the gates of Winter Feast in year one and, actually having tears streaming down my face because 15,000 people were running through the door. but that was because of the work that we'd done to really galvanise the local community, local business, who we encouraged to put, you know, red lights and all the rest of it and become part of the festival. There was a ongoing dialogues with the local community. So in a nutshell, I guess, you know, they were the main stakeholders. The mainlanders came later.
And just to clarify, we've got a short video of Dark Mofo for those who are not familiar with it. Quite a iconic event it's developed into. Gil, Mona, the original event that it was built off was a summer arts event, was it? And I think it was somewhere else.
So there's an event called Mofo, which is a summer event, and that started about 3 or 4 years before Mona the museum opened. So Mona stands for Museum of Old and New Art, which is a significant gallery that was funded by David Walsh, and he's a key stakeholder. I should have mentioned before, obviously, but in saying Mona, it's kind of emblematic of David Walsh, who is a local Hobart man, born and bred, made a lot of money through gambling and decided he wanted to do something altruistic with it. So in his, and has an amazing art collection. So he opened a gallery, be about 10 years ago now. But just leading up to the gallery opening, he did an event called Mofo, which was a music festival held in Hobart in January. That's since moved to Launceston, but at the same time of the year. So to build the brand of the gallery, he did Mofo, then came the gallery opening, then came Dark Mofo.
Okay, very good.
Sorry, Chris, were we going to show the video, or should we leave that till later?
Oh no, let's do that.
Okay.
So here's a quick introduction to Dark Mofo, and you can see what it offers.
Long ago, the clock washed midnight away, bringing the dawn, I must be dreaming. Where did the night go?
So it's quite a varied sort of arts, culture, food event.
Yeah, it's a celebration of the winter solstice. So we sort of thought, the thing that everybody was most afraid of in a way, and that was winter in Hobart, was the thing. As it's a great example of what Stuart was saying. It's kind of playing to your strengths and your point of difference. It's the coldest place in Australia to have winter, for winter. So rather than pretend that it wasn't cold, we celebrated. The event actually sits over the winter solstice, but we thought, how can we bring that to the fore and really celebrate that and encourage people to come out into the cold? And it's a celebration of winter and of the centuries of narratives in every community around the world around the winter solstice. So it's very rich sort of creative narrative to use for an event.
Very good.
But yeah, it goes from food to theatre to music to big outdoor lighting installations, community events, and the winter feast, which is now held nearly over the entire 3 weeks, which is big food and wine and music, family-friendly event.
So what about examples for 4, 5, and 6, Stu?
Yeah, I just might make one point before we move on to those, Chris, is that often, I'm sure a lot of the people in the webinar today would have maybe councillors or mayors or executives that have got stars in their eyes when they see these sort of events and go, we need that. I suppose the thing to remind them of at that point is A, these things take a long time to build, and B, they require a very big appetite for risk. As you saw, Mofo, that's there's some pretty risky stuff happening there. And yeah. Lastly, it requires significant support financial wise for a long time. So it's all very well and good for the powers that be that a lot of us work for them to say we need one of those festivals, make one of them happen. It's very, very poignant at that point in time to remind them that what they see has years and years and years and millions of dollars behind them to get to that point. So it really requires some faith.
And if I can just jump in here too, a key stakeholder I very forgot to mention, which is naughty, was the City of Hobart, who gave $100,000 a year for the first 3 years and now gives significantly more for the Winter Feast. And $100,000 a year at that time was the biggest grant they gave to any event, even events of their own that they produced. And so that was a leap of faith. Just backing what Stu said, that was a leap of faith from them, because they knew if anyone could bring people to Hobart at that time of the year, they had faith that Mona could do it. And it was also a leap of faith in terms of knowing that Mona has got a risky, sort of dark side, sort of playful kind of brand. And there were some very interesting conversations around some of the things that we wanted to do. I totally back it. You've got to be able to take risks, and you've got to be able to have faith in the people that you engage to do these events if you really want to do something different.
But just to emphasise, because I think it's a 7 to 9 day event, isn't it? Dark Mofo?
It's 2 weeks, yeah.
2 weeks. So it's been transformational in terms of Hobart and the winter season. And so if you can pull it off, these sorts of events, more than any other way in which you can change your product offering, can be really a complete step change. And particularly in those shoulder and off seasons, creating a compelling reason to visit and creating an opportunity to sort of change your brand, your perception. Okay, Stu, do we want to have a look at the other 4 to 5? Just a quick time check. We've got 15 minutes left, so we want to allow a few minutes for Q&A.
Okay, to use a slightly smaller example than those, for a unique selling point, Parks Elvis Festival up in Parks, which is regional regional New South Wales, town of 20,000 people. It swells to 40,000 people now during the Elvis Festival. The point of difference being that there isn't another Elvis Festival in Australia. So if you're an Elvis fan, and there's plenty of them, and they're very ardent and very passionate, if they want to go to an Elvis Festival outside of going over to the States, Parks is the place they need to go. And it's so compelling that Parks, it's in January, at a period in time where Parks is generally about 40 degrees centigrade. It's such a compelling offer for these people that they will dress up in all of the Elvis paraphernalia and be quite happy to sit in 40 degree temperatures. That's just quite how unique a selling point they have. Target audience profile, Gil, I might just get you to touch on this in your time at Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, but it's a well-off audience that is able to travel and spend.
Yeah, and it's an international audience and has been for many, many years. Mardi Gras is over 40 years old now, so it's a very well-established event. But it started as this is a fantastic example of how an audience can grow. It started as a protest and has ended up as the biggest celebration of gay and lesbian pride in the world. And the target audience, I guess, has broadened out as it's got larger. But yeah, it's an international event, and you can stand on Oxford Street or anywhere in Darlinghurst during the Mardi Gras season and not hear an Australian accent. It is, I guess, in that sense, it does target more affluent audience, but it also has a very strong core Sydney-based and Australian-based audience. And without that strong core community support, the event wouldn't happen, whether it's from volunteers or just the sense of ownership that the local community have over the organisation is fundamentally important to its success.
And then the final example I'll use is just for the sixth fundamental around planning and positioning, point and in the year that you'll actually put the event on. Sorry, Chris, I think I might have, oh, there we go. The Eden down in the southeast corner of Australia, it's quite an isolated place, Eden. It's about an 8-hour drive from Sydney or Melbourne. And they've actually put this event on to capture grey nomads that are coming back from Queensland. So the grey nomads are generally up in Queensland, June, July, August, September. They've decided to actually try and capture them as they make their way back down to Victoria by putting an event on in November, and just to say, hey, look, we know you're on your way home. Why don't you stop with us for a week and have a good time? So that's an example of an event that just is playing into that idea of being smart about the way in which it plans and positions itself. So I think that sort of brings us to index. I mean, I would welcome any questions from yourself or indeed anyone that's still with us.
Very good. And we'll be sharing out links to all of this. So a couple of questions. Sarah is wondering, in terms of event funding, is Victoria, in your experience, is that, you know, the fund guidelines, is that seen as a well-run, well-organised, sort of contestable fund? Because obviously these things can get political, and one of the issues I think Sarah's flagging is, you know, unless you've got a really robust way of picking winners, there can be some significant blowback to councils and others who might be funding it.
Yeah, I think the best example for me of a contestable fund is, in fact, in Tourism Events Queensland and their destination, it's their QDEP program is what they call it. It's very, very well defined, and that they take a slightly different approach to other states in that they actually demand co-investment from the council in which the event is held. So I'd actually, whilst Victoria's is a good fund, it is under the process of being restructured as we speak. But for a reference point, I'd log on to the Tourism Events Queensland website and go to the QDEP funding area. And the way in which they go about it, I think, is probably the best example at the moment in Australia.
And we'll include that link along with the Victoria and Tasmania fund guidelines in the follow-up email. Rob is asking about volunteers. So what are some of the techniques you've seen that are most successful in terms of attracting and sort of building the, you know, the training and support of volunteers?
Probably the biggest.
Sorry, go.
I was just going to say probably the biggest volunteer event that I've worked on is Mardi Gras. It has a core group of paid staff, but it runs on the strength of its volunteer program. And I think, you know, attracting volunteers is all about a sense of ownership, a sense of empowerment, a sense of clarity, being really clear with what the expectation is both ways. And, you know, an opportunity to learn skills. I know literally hundreds of people who have become event professionals from starting out as volunteers at Mardi Gras. Yeah, that and Winter Feast had a certain amount of volunteers, but Mardi Gras, would hasten to say, would be one of the biggest volunteer events in Australia, that's for sure. Stu?
Yeah, I think that just speaks to a real deep connection with community, and I suppose that comes back to that first fundamental there is community connection and capacity. And if you get an event or the core of an event right that speaks to the collective psyche of a community, then your ability to retain and to attract volunteers in the first place is always going to be a lot stronger, I'd say.
So let me ask a final question before we wrap up. We've just got a couple of other resources to share. So after an event has been running for a number of years, at what point are you looking for, success? We're talking about that these things can take a number of times, but what are some of the sort of milestones or indicators, Stu and Gil, that you look for that an event is on track to become a Dark Mofo or a Mardi Gras or a Vivid Sydney? And, what are the indicators that might mean you have to sort of pull the plug at some point?
In making the business case, we had a really big battle on our hands after year 3 of Vivid to justify the spend to state government. And the really big indicator that we hung our hat on was the fact that we were benchmarking across 80 events in New South Wales across the entire year. The extent to which Sydney-siders were proud to be from Sydney, or the extent to which an event made them proud to be from Sydney. And Vivid Sydney out-indexed every single other event on the calendar. New Year's Eve was the only one that came even close. And I think from memory, it even out-indexed New Year's Eve on that front. So for those people in Sydney that were aware of the event, they loved it so much that it made it very hard for the government to say, okay, we're going to pull our funding, because they would have experienced a pretty significant backlash. So I'd say that the metric that really helped us over the line to convince state government that it was worth to keep funding when people still weren't arriving as visitors was there's a pride in this event amongst locals that we haven't seen before. And that was our real key indicator in those early years.
Yeah, I think too, just keep, apart from just the economic success, I think ensuring that, your audience is always, getting a fresh experience. I think a really rigorous approach to the creative direction of events can't be underestimated. And, not only a key part of success for me as a director of events is not only are we getting these same audiences back and offering them something new, but we're always attracting new audiences as well. Length of stay at an event, all those sorts of things. It's with Dark Mofo, it's something that we knew in year, by the end of year 1, we knew we had a hit on our hands. Not everything's like that, but I think there's a number of things that sit alongside, the economic benefits that are equally as important, or that are mutually, linked, mutually beneficial.
Yeah, and I think from the international best practices we saw around the world, and Slovenia's got their own sort of version of the 6 fundamentals, is having a clear sort of set of objectives that you outline at the start and measure against those objectives. And it needs to touch on the various points that we're talking about, not just economic and financial return, but these critical components of community engagement, sense of pride and ownership, and these broader opportunities. So Dark Mofo, the Mardi Gras, Eden Caravan Muster, will include a variety of these links. There's additional really interesting backstories on all of those. There's that web address again, if you want to download the Domestic Tourism Global Benchmarking Study, which talks about those 5 international best practices, one of which is events, and then uses examples from around the world to illustrate those. And then just a brief commercial interlude. With Stu's input, we've developed a set of event support services in 4 parts, which include a region-wide assessment of the events calendar, and that uses the 6 fundamentals as a checklist, and includes a community survey to really understand the resonance, the commitment, and the engagement with the community and their sense of pride, as well as stakeholder interviews. There can be an in-depth health check, which is a deep dive into specific events, including reviewing their plans, financial, operational, etc. Interview with the event organisers, etc. And then there can be customised education and support, either as a workshop or a series of webinars to work with both the EDAs, the RTOs, and the event community and organisers. And so that can be customised to your needs. And then we have built with Uber Media, which is the world's largest mobile location data provider, as some enhanced event reporting to supplement some of the various reporting that's outlined in the MB assessment framework that has been published. And that's got some great sort of dispersal reporting. This is the sort of scoring you can get from the regional event assessment, which really looks at all those 6 fundamentals and ranks and assesses. I should stress this is an example only. And this is an example of the dispersal reporting. You can see where you can pick, this is Boston, one of our clients in the United States, where you can pick a particular event location and see where else those visitors go, how long they stay, etc. So thank you so much, Stu and Gil. Don't hesitate, anybody, to reach out to us for more information. And we look forward to connecting with you shortly. And all the very best, Stu and Gil, in terms of what's going on in Victoria. Hopefully there's been some really good news out of there in the last week to 10 days. So long may that continue.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks.